Hi guys, welcome to screencast on sociocultural studies. New topic is Australia, so the last of our country analysis, and I've decided to put the microphone on this time so you can actually hear me. This focus, what a screencast tonight is just quickly going to have a look at the characteristics of Australia as a country. Now, luckily, it's quite similar to America, so there's nothing too new to remember. Also, we then have to look at the nature of sport in Australia. Now, the key thing here is sport in Australia can be described as an obsession. It's, front page news. 90%, I think this was a few years ago, but 90% of the population are kind of, in terms of research, take part in physical activity. So it's a hugely big thing in Australia. What we have to understand is why. What is the reasons behind it, like this kind of national obsession or preoccupation with sport? So we're going to look at the nature of sport in Australia and what makes it so popular. We'll then move on in your next lesson on Australia, look at Australian rules football, which we'll be kind of looking at as a 10-mark question potentially. So if I come back onto what we're doing then, so characteristics of Australia as a country. So if we look at this quickly, you're basically saying, first thing, it's a young nation. So like America, it's a relatively young nation. It's only been independent from the British Isles or Great Britain for a few hundred years. The indigenous population in Australia were the Aboriginals. And then I put onto here, it's a large country. So it's a huge country, so they're 32 times the size of Britain, but it is sparsely populated. If you have a look up at the kind of map I've got on here, you see like the kind of big cities. You've got Perth, Darwin, Brisbane, Sydney. All of these are located on the kind of coast. So basically they're coastal cities. In the middle area here, you have a load of bush or outback where, there's very few people living there. It's one other characteristic of the country. So Australia is a multicultural society. So there are lots of different cultures and races that live in Australia. So multicultural, that should keep it there. So 3 to 4 kind of characteristics of the country of Australia. Now what we need to do then is have a look at the nature of sport in Australia and understand why it is this kind of, they have an obsession with sport. So if I just move through this one and come on to here. So why is sport such high status, etc. I'm going to go through these bits on here, or I'll come back and do them one at a time. So first key thing is that, if you write down the point, so anything that I put at the start is the point, and then you're talking about how that links to the word sport and Australia. So if you're starting here then, there's a favourable climate first of all. So all year round there is decent weather, therefore this encourages participation in sport. Now, your example I always use cricket. How many times, if you're a cricket player, how often is a game called off in England? I mean, you're probably talking about half a season last year that was games were called off. Now, in Australia, you have this favourable climate all year round, which will encourage sports participation. So again, we're always linking the word Australia and sport. Next bit. There are accessible, if you can change that, I'll put that in front, natural resources. So accessible natural resources, don't worry about the space so much. So an example of a accessible natural resource would be the sea. There would also be beach. So if we talk about the sea as a natural resource that's accessible because of all these cities being coastal cities, you're talking about things such as surfing, windsurfing, etc. Now, another reason why sport is such high status or is such a key component of Australian society is this kind of concept of tradition. Now, basically, Australian main sports are English sports, and this is because when Australia was a British colony, English people took their sports to Australia. So rugby, cricket are certainly sports which are really, kind of played in Australia. So what they have is Australia kind of really, if you remember this word tradition that we talked about before, they are keen to recreate sporting success against England, and this actually has a term that you can be credited for in an exam. This concept of Australia's absolutely loving beating England is called pommy bashing. Now, the nickname that Australians give England are pommies, so therefore the term pommy bashing is what they refer to as beating the English. They have a real kind of issue against England because England used, or Great Britain used, Australia as a dumping ground for convicts and criminals before Australia was an independent state. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the start of the lesson, but you don't have to write that much detail. Pommy bashing, Australian, keen to recreate sporting success against England. So going on from there. Now, In Australia, there is a real high level of political support and funding. The reason why is because the government know that within Australian society, sport is so popular, therefore it can act as a vote catcher for government or kind of groups working towards office. So if you've got that bit in, that's all you need to have. Political support and funding, so there is adequate or there is a good political support and funding, which acts as vote catchers for political parties. Moving on. This is an optional one. In fact, I'm going to leave that one. If you want to just sum it up, sport acts as a nation builder. Before us, there was the Sydney Olympics about 20 years ago that kind of acted as a nation builder, just like London 2012 did for England. You also have this concept that kind of sport in Australia is fashionable, okay, so it's cool to be sporty. It can actually raise your social status by taking part in sport, much as it is in most countries, but certainly in Australia, you're thinking there are certain things that make people socially desirable. Sport is one of them. So fashionable, cool to be sporty, increased social status from playing sport. Another example, sport, and if I can just kind of, don't worry about sport for all, if I could just get this in now, sport is the vehicle by which Australia attempts to promote equality. So what you have in Australia is a multicultural society. However, sport is one of the main platforms by which you can promote this equality. So, for example, Aussie Rules Football will have both Australian and Aboriginal performers. So that's an example of that. Going on, sport in high schools in Australia is really high status. Okay, it's considered an important part of the curriculum. Going on, we'll go to the success of national teams. If you can put that as well, but the key one is role models. There are lots of successful role models in Australia. For example, I'll show you a clip tomorrow or in your next lesson, which is on Shane Warne, who is a cricket player who's extremely influential in the rise in participation in cricket, for example. So the key thing on a role model, okay, sporting stars or sporting success from people such as Shane Warne will increase sporting participation in Australia. Okay, going on. And I suppose this will be your last two. So we'll do bush culture first then. So if you remember, we talked about frontier spirit for America and them having that cultural ideology that kind of like early settlers moved from east to west using physical force. Well, what you've got in Australia is this kind of I suppose a little bit of a parallel, and this is called the bush culture. So again, this is a cultural or kind of ideological kind of concept that's basically saying that bush culture promotes that, in order to survive, or early Aboriginals, for example, or early settlers to Australia, in order to survive, they had to be able to kind of, I suppose, not use physical force, but certainly manliness is something you could put with it. The key description I'd ask you to put is that bush culture promotes this kind of concept of survival of the fittest, and Australians believe that because of this kind of the early times where people had to survive in the bush, and so you had to have survival of the fittest, this led to kind of parallels to sports performance, because obviously to play sport, this requires survival of the fittest, inverted commas. So that's your kind of penultimate nature, and your final one is very easy that you've used in sport, modern sport in England or professional sport in England, America, and finally Australia. So sport is heavily linked to, or sport in Australia is heavily linked to sponsorship and the media. Okay, so there are your key bits. Can you try and have notes then for, you're looking at kind of what, 7, 8, 9, 10 natures of sport in Australia. Call down notes, key description, and some questions down to the side. Okay, thank you very much.